a homicide case that goes back into the 1970s, and we have identified finally the victim of that tragedy.
She had more friends than a lot of people I knew. She would help anybody. Didn't matter who it was.
She was a good sister.
It's awful when people can't find closure after a crime is committed. I really can't think of anything worse than not knowing where a loved one is and never being able to grieve properly. And it's horrible to think that there are missing people who were found but were just never identified. So nobody could even call your mom and tell her to stop searching. In these 3 crazy cases, there seemed like there was no chance that the victims could be laid to rest. But online forums, new technology, and a lot of people working on the case for free can make an enormous difference. So let's find out how. On October 29th, 2006, the police answered a really disturbing call. In Kilgore, Texas, 2 men had discovered the body of a woman lying face down on top of a pile of burning bushes. Even creepier, it looked like she hadn't been there for very long. The police tried to figure out what happened to her, but there just wasn't a lot to go on. Because of how she'd been treated, it was hard to even guess how old she was. At least, not at first. At the scene, investigators recovered a purple or lavender sweater and her jeans. She also had $40 on her, which will come up again later in the story. They figured out she'd probably passed away around 8 or 9 p.m. the night before. But strangest of all, she had really perfect teeth. There wasn't even a single filling or an imperfection, which is how she became known as the girl with the perfect teeth. But mostly I'll call her Lavender for this case. Investigators were stumped by Lavender because there weren't any matches of those perfect teeth or her DNA on record. What was even stranger about it? Well, nobody had registered someone like her missing. So either nobody cared, nobody was around to care, or she was a long way from home. And that's so sad. More clues at the site suggested she might have been related as well. Locals said that they'd seen a lot of sketchy people in the area when this had happened, but there were no leads at first. However, by 2007, the cops had a suspect in mind. They'd narrowed it down to Joseph Wayne Burnett, already known as a really sketchy guy with a lot of relevant convictions. Unfortunately, law enforcement still couldn't directly link him to the case. They still needed proof that he hurt her. Then, in 2014, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created a simulation of Lavender. One mother did think this could be her little girl, but the DNA ruled that out, which is sad, but probably a good thing for her real family. So eventually Lavender was buried in Long Hill without her real name. The case went cold, but a few years later, things were about to change. Now, the further these cases go back, the less likely you'd think that the cops can ever solve them. In the case of Paulette Jaster, it seemed completely hopeless, but sometimes the very smallest detail can make a huge difference. Paulette was born in a Michigan ranch in 1954, and everyone thought she was an amazing person. She was the homecoming queen and the captain of the basketball team. She also had a really loving family. She went to study at Central Michigan University and seemed to have a promising future. It was a huge shock to them all when she dropped out of college after just 1 semester. Sadly, she had developed a very serious mental condition and kept making awful decisions. She also broke up with her high school sweetheart and resigned from a really good job at the Chevrolet factory. When she began smoking hash, this drove her even further away from her family. But what made everyone suspect something was wrong was when, in 1974, she walked into the sheriff's office and told the police that bad people were after her. Even Henry in California were trying to kill her and trying to use her brain. But it was when, in 1977, Paulette had a bad fight with a customer at a restaurant, a judge sent her to a state mental health hospital for treatment. She had a lot of issues, and it was about all that they could do for her. But they couldn't keep her there for long. Paulette quickly signed herself out of the hospital and went home in 1978 after just a couple months of treatment. In 1978, after another fight with her dad, she stayed with some relatives in Florida. Then, in 1979, she went to visit her family home in Michigan for her mom's birthday, but left soon after. That was the very last time that anyone in her family ever saw her again. She was spotted heading for the Interstate 60, carrying an army duffel bag on May 12, 1979, and her social security number showed that she worked at Walgreens in Arizona. The trail ended there, and it wouldn't be until someone finally spotted a crucial detail in an unsolved case that Paulette would be located. But that would take a really long while and a lot of research. Another case that took a very long time to reach some closure started on February 5th, 1975. 3 boys found a skeleton by a river in Strongville, or Stream Run Reservation in Ohio. The autopsy identified her as a young female who had been shot in the head. At first, people thought that Ted Bundy was responsible, or that she was a missing billionaire's daughter, Patty Hearst, but that was all quickly debunked. So who this woman truly was remained a total mystery. I mean, given what happened to her, somebody must have known exactly how she'd ended up there, right? And the actual reasons why she stayed unnamed for so long drove me crazy. And they're probably going to drive you crazy as well. Because yes, someone did have a pretty good idea of who this poor lady was. And they even called the police to make sure. After seeing the report on the remains on the news, in 1975, Mike Pagano was sure that this mysterious skeleton was his missing sister, Linda. But the police brushed this off, saying that the skeletal remains didn't match the age or height.
Oh no, that's not your sister.
So he didn't pursue that lead any further. Despite this setback, Mike and his other sister, Cheryl Pagano, were still desperate to find Linda.
She would help anybody. Didn't matter who it was.
She was a good sister.
Yeah. When we was little, she used to tease me all the time, but yeah, that went both
When
ways.
she was little, she always squealed on us.
Yeah.
Their sister was only 17 when she vanished, and she left behind a lot of people who missed her. Her brother remembers her as a really great person.
Linda had a good head on her shoulders. She always did the right thing.
She really loved her Mustang car too. She'd saved up money working at a root beer stand to afford it. But her home life had been confusing, and her parents had divorced, then remarried, but quickly separated again. For a while, all 3, Linda, Mike, and Cheryl Pagano, had lived with their stepfather, Byron Claffin. But he was horrible to them and often drank too much. So Mike and Cheryl left that house by the lake and they moved in with their mom. Strangely, Linda got along with Byron really well and stayed on in that house with him. Then one night in late August 1974, she went to a rock concert with her boyfriend and didn't get back until after midnight. And this really didn't sit well with stepdaddy Byron. Byron said he kicked her out and that she just left the house and never returned. Well, he was the only witness to this, so I have questions, especially because right after that,
That was it. It's like she vanished right off the face of the earth.
like her sister said, nobody ever saw Linda again. The police were eventually called, but they treated Linda as a runaway, despite several enormous red flags. For a start, Linda wasn't even considered someone who would ever run away, and not without a single word to anybody. Even stranger, Linda hadn't taken her beloved Mustang, which she worked so hard to buy. Now, I think that her just leaving town without that awesome car seems extremely unlikely. It's not like she'd even needed to hitchhike, which is pretty dangerous on its own. And why didn't she just go to her mom's house? Thinking the same, and despite reporting her as missing, it was left entirely up to Linda's brother and sister, Mike and Cheryl to get any answers.
We were the only ones that did anything. The cops did not do a thing back then.
They got busy and handed out flyers and tried to get the attention to Linda's case, but no authorities took it that seriously. I guess 1974 really was a different time, right? Today, this kind of case would be all over the news. But then, the first possible lead they had was in 1975, when those boys found a woman's remains by the river. Linda's brother wondered if that poor lady could be his missing sister and called the cops. I bet he was hoping it wasn't her, but he had to make sure. Mike hit a dead end when the policewoman who answered his call dismissed him. They were sure it wasn't her because they thought the skeleton was older and taller. So nobody checked that out any further. For a long time, poor Linda stayed lost. Would anyone solve this case or confess to what had happened to her? Going back to our first case, in 2018, the investigators who looked into the mysterious lavender doe had a major breakthrough when Joseph Wayne Burnett finally confessed to ending Lavender's life. Joseph was under suspicion for another awful murder. A woman called Felicia Pearson had been living with him and then went missing. Her mom called it in, and he was the prime suspect. When the cops arrested him, he finally opened up to what he'd done to poor Felicia and Lavender as well. Joseph claimed that Lavender had willingly gone with him in the car, but she then tried to steal $40 from him. For that reason, he snapped and ended her life. And perhaps he didn't even take that back from her, given that $40 was found on her body. Either way, he was a total monster. But that still didn't clear up who Lavender really was.
We would get people off the internet that would say, hey, I think this might be so-and-so, and we would follow up on that and eventually rule it out. And that just went on for years. I mean, it's basically all we had.
A little bit here and a little bit there, but not much.
Right.
And no solution.
No solution, no name.
Enter the DNA Doe Project. DNA Doe Project was set up to encourage direct DNA testing to identify people like Lavender, who ended up with no name after they'd passed away. Fun fact, this is the same technique that caught the Gold State Killer in 2013, so pretty impressive.
At that time, realized this was a year before well before the Golden State Killer came on the scene. So, approaching law enforcement agencies with some idea they didn't understand that we were interested in, we had to pick the right agencies that were open to that.
DNA Doe Project raised $1,400 to try and find out Lavender's true identity using a DNA profile analysis and genealogy research, which proved her ethnicity and ancestry.
That database allows us to look for other people that share some DNA with our unidentified person.
Once they had that, the volunteers at DNA Doe can cross-reference family tree information until they could hopefully track down Lavender Doe's family. So the DNA Doe investigators were soon hard at work, putting together a family tree of the DNA information, hoping for a lead. In Lavender's case, once they were working with the sheriff, this meant it only took them about 6 weeks to figure out who she really was. Even so, it took a lot of very efficient detective work. Finally, the database helped to track down Lavender's family. They discovered that Lavender had a first cousin in East Texas, 30 miles from where she was found. But Lavender's real name still wouldn't be released until after Joseph Wayne Burnett went on trial in 2020. As for Paulette Jaster, she had been missing for a few years before her family started to hear anything. Someone sent her mom a lead in 1983. Apparently, Paulette was now in Florida, but she was also in a lot of trouble. No sources about this got confirmed, but it got even weirder after that. One of Paulette's sisters started getting phoned up by a silent caller. While anyone might find those calls creepy, she was sure that this was really Paulette. This was never cleared up. Really annoying. Another 7 years later, in 1996, state police sent out a bulletin asking for more information on Paulette. probably to see if anyone could remember anything about her. Incredibly, they did get a call saying that a Blue Earth, Minnesota Jane Doe could be her. But sadly, this wasn't her either, and no other attempts to revive the case worked. Once again, the trial and the case had gone completely cold. Despite this, Paulette's brothers and sisters wouldn't give up hope, and eventually they found something really important, just as they'd completely given up hope. Turns out that time is no match for technology and a determined internet sleuth. Poor Linda Pagano's case had sat untouched for almost 40 years, and that unnamed skeleton was buried at Potter's Field on Highland Hills. Then, by total random chance, a Cleveland state biology student called Christina Skates was looking for an ancestor and noticed a grave that really got her attention. There was barely any information on the record, and the woman had been buried without a name.
It was a weird feeling. It really was. I really can't describe it. Kind of just confusion as to why she wasn't identified.
So Christina got really interested and searched for more answers in the library. Once she learned about the Strongsville case, she fought to get a hold of case information from the cops. Eventually, the body was exhumed and the new information was added to the digital database. Eventually, the cops sent Christina a digital file about the Jane Doe. She submitted all the information about it to the Web Sleuth's website and to a subreddit called Our Unresolved Mysteries. The case went viral on Reddit, and a forensic artist on the site recreated what the victim might have looked like. Carl Kopelman was a facial reconstructionist artist, and he created this image of the skeleton victim, hoping it would remind someone of who she was. The case was also added to a federal database for missing persons, but the remains of the woman still weren't listed on any networks. Christina also contacted the local medical databases. For a while, they heard nothing at all. But could all of this hard work ever lead to an answer? Just who was the Strongsville Jane Doe? Lavender Doe's true identity was finally released after the trial of the monster who confessed to ending her life. They revealed that her real name was Dana Lynn Dodd. Her mom left her when she was an infant, and creepily enough, she had also passed away in 2006, just like her daughter. But Dana didn't have a home, so from when she was only 12, she had been brought up with her stepmom, Amanda Gadd, and lived with her family in Florida. Her stepmom said that Dana was a fantastic person to have around. She'd even tutor math to Amanda's son. We always sat down at the dinner table, and she loved that we always asked, "How was your day?" She looked forward to that, and she told me she looked forward to that time as a family because she never had that living in Arizona, so that meant a lot to her. But despite that happy home life, Dana left their home when she was pretty young to live with her boyfriend, although this turned out to be a really bad move. In 2000, Dana joined a magazine sales team. This was actually a super sketchy cover organization for selling people and trafficking them. The people were controlled using illegal substances. Unfortunately, working for them is how Dana had ended up in the path of that creepy monster. And by then, there was nobody to register that she'd even gone missing. The boyfriend had vanished, and her family also thought she was in Ohio and had been searching in completely the wrong direction. Also, that sketchy kind of organization probably didn't want the attention. You know? So she entered that stranger's car at this Walmart parking lot, and it was the worst mistake Dana would ever make. Now that they knew what had happened to her, Dana's Florida family decided to leave her buried where she was in Longview, Texas. They were so moved that strangers used to put flowers on her grave even before they knew her real name. So they let Dana rest in Longview and headed to the headstone with her real identity. At the memorial service held at the White Cemetery, her sister Amanda Gadd said, "It means so much to us that so many people took her and embraced her before she knew knew who she was. So at least Dana Dodd can now also be remembered by her family as well. But they'd never have been found without the internet pooling resources to find her family tree. And what happened to monstrous Joseph Burnett? You'll probably be really glad to hear that he got sentenced to 50 years for the homicide of Dana and another 50 years for the homicide of his second victim, Felicia Pearson. He just isn't getting out again, which honestly sounds good to me. And at that point, Dana Dodd was the 10th person that the DNA Doe Project had managed to identify and bring a little bit of peace and closure to the families. And they're already working hard on solving lots more cases, with even more requests for help coming their way all the time. It turns out there were a lot of people interested in solving cases like this, and online, a lot of heads are better than one. Also looking online for help, in 2006, Paulette Jaster's brothers and sisters found Web Sleuths, a website where people try and solve crimes and missing people. They put all the information they had on there, and the internet hive mind got to work. Debbie Saunders, known as Houston Mom, noticed there was a victim of a 1980 hit-and-run case who matched Paulette's description. A forensic scientist, Dr. Sharon M. Derrick, agreed that this could possibly be the link they were after, but it was over 20 years since it happened, and they had no fingerprints, and nobody had collected the DNA when that poor hit-and-run victim was buried. So they had to try something else. They cross-referenced lots of dental charts and eventually discovered some that matched, despite a few gaps and no x-rays. Don't forget to floss, people. Then they noticed how the freckles on the side of Paulette's cheek matched strongly with the image of Jane Doe. Paulette's sister Peg took one look at the photo of the unnamed victim and said, "It took me a minute to look at that Jane Doe photo, but the longer I looked, the more I was sure. I know her. It's her." Paulette had finally been found after 34 long years of being lost. They'd figured out that on March 28, 1980, she had hitched a ride from Arizona to Houston in a truck. She'd left that 18-wheeler truck on Interstate 10 at around midnight. Not sure why, and she got really unlucky. It turns out that a car driver who was way over the legal alcohol limit had hit her with his car on the interstate bridge. It ended her life. She had no ID on her body, and her bag was still in the truck's cabin. Her bag had the ID in it, and she only went missing because that Army-style bag had been left in the driver's cab for years, and nobody, not a single cop, had ever looked at Paulette's bag or picked it up to check inside it. And I have some big questions for that truck driver too, because it would have solved the mystery straight away. So yeah, that kind of missed detail drives me totally crazy. Instead, Paulette's family had to hold on for a whole 40 years. They must have been in agony without any answers about her. They were wondering that whole time how she was, what she was doing, and whether or not she was okay, or why she didn't ever call. That's so awful and totally insane. They also traced the drunk driver. It was a man called Robert S. Couch, who'd been 23 when he did this. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter and failure to stop and provide help. Robert pled guilty when it happened back in July 1980 and got 5 years probation. Paulette's remains had been buried in Houston, and her family left her there, but her family replaced the anonymous Jane Doe ID number with a plaque that showed her true name. Her sister Peg said, "I feel blessed to know something about what happened. It answers so many questions, like why she didn't contact anyone. And at that point in the mystery, answers are the best you can hope for." All that hard work paid off. The information eventually found its way to the cold case police investigators who made a DNA link in 2018 to Mike and Cheryl Pagano, using her sister's DNA. This confirmed that the woman they found was Linda. All of Christina Skate's hard work had paid off.
If it wasn't for her, we never would have found Linda. She'd still be in Pottersfield.
And we'd still be wondering.
Yeah.
They were finally able to put their sister to rest and hold a funeral. You can see Christina Skates there, also saying goodbye to the case and the woman she'd tried to help. They're now trying to find who could have taken her life. Unfortunately, justice might be a very long time off, and her stepfather Byron, who was definitely the prime suspect, already passed away back in 1990. But at least Linda had found her way home again.
I thank everybody for being here today for an update we have on a very old case, a homicide case that goes back into the 1970s. And we have identified, finally, the victim of that tragedy.
Even though not all of these cases have not the entirely satisfying closure that I'd like, at least they finally learned who these women were and sent them home. What's really incredible to me is that one stupid mistake or one ignored phone call could lead to decades of wondering until families finally got their answers. What do you think about these cases? And what was your favorite story? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.